Alright, today's video is on lesson 4.2, congruence and triangles. And we've talked a little bit about how to indicate on triangles, or any shape for that matter, when things are congruent to each other. And so we've been using what I call the little hashtags. So in this particular triangle ABC, line segment AB is congruent to MN because they have the same marking on them. And CB is congruent to ON because they both have the same marking on them. So what we can say is that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle MNO. It is extremely important that you label the triangles when you're talking about congruence, so that the angles that are congruent to each other match up in the name, and the line segments that are congruent to each other match up in the name. So it says because these triangles are congruent, the corresponding sides and corresponding angles are congruent as well. So because angle A is the first letter in this first triangle, it has to match up with angle M, which is the first letter in the second triangle. If they don't, then we have not labeled them correctly, and it is not correct if they are not matched up. Okay, so the triangles are congruent to each other, so we can say that angle A is congruent to angle M. Angle B would be congruent to angle N, and we can see that both in the picture as well as on the name, that angle ABC is congruent to MNO. Then angle C is congruent to angle O. So then we're also going to match up the side lengths. So MN is congruent to AB, NO then is congruent to BC. And again, you notice that NO is the second two letters in the name as it's listed here. And so BC has to be congruent to that because those are the second two letters. And then find the third statement that's blank there and write that down. All right, the next thing we want to know, what conclusion can we make about angles A and angle J in that triangle? So if we look at those two triangles, angle A and angle J have to be congruent to each other because B is congruent to K and C is congruent to L. So A has to be congruent to J. So it says here in this theorem that if two angles of one triangle are congruent to two angles of another triangle, then the third angles are also congruent to each other. So that's the theorem that we need to make sure we know. All right, so these next properties should look familiar to you. The reflexive property, but now we're talking about triangles, as well as the symmetric property. Again, talking about triangles. The properties are the exact same though, as is the transitive property. So now we're looking at congruent triangles, and those three properties hold true for our congruence. So again, I've listed down here, when we label triangles that are congruent, the corresponding angles must match in the name, and that's what I explained to you at the beginning as well. Here are a couple problems I'd like you to try. So question number one, I'd like you to answer the question, are those two triangles congruent? And to justify your answer. You don't necessarily have to write a two-column proof, but do have either a property or a theorem or a couple that help you to identify those two triangles if they are congruent or not. Okay? You may even have to use things like corresponding angles, or alternate interior angles, or alternate exterior angles if we have parallel lines. I don't know if we have parallel lines there or not, but that is something that we could use. So here in problem number 2, this is where I would like you to do a proof. So you're given the information, and I want to know, or I want you to prove, is triangle MNO congruent to triangle QPO? So in order to do that, again, you might need to use alternate interior angles, alternate exterior angles, and in this particular shape, we know that the MN is parallel to PQ because it has those triangle markings on it. So we do know that those two lines are parallel to each other. So that might help you as well. Have those two problems done for tomorrow, your notes completed, and have a good night.